There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a capital when an empire realizes it is lost not through conquest, but through irrelevance. It is not the deafening roar of explosions or the chaos of retreat. It is the quiet, suffocating hush of influence evaporating like morning dew under an unforgiving sun. We are witnessing that silent vanishing act across the Middle East today. The events unfolding from Tehran to Baghdad, from Damascus to Sana'a, are not merely diplomatic maneuvers or regional power plays. To view them as such is to miss the tectonic shift beneath our feet. What we are watching in real time is the systematic, methodical, and bloodless expulsion of American influence from a region it has dominated for 8 decades. Iran has achieved what no military force could accomplish. It has removed the United States from the Middle East without firing a shot that Washington could answer with its trillion-dollar war machine. For decades, I have studied the mechanics of empire, the rise and fall of hegemonic powers, and the brutal mathematics of geopolitical dominance. And I tell you now that we are standing at one of those rare pivots in history where the old order does not collapse with dramatic violence but simply fades into strategic irrelevance. The assumption that has guided American foreign policy since 1945, that the Middle East belongs in Washington's sphere of control, that Arab oil must flow through American-approved channels, that resistance to American dictates can be crushed through sanctions and surgical strikes, died not in a spectacular military defeat, but in a series of diplomatic victories that the Western media desperately wants you to ignore. The normalization agreements between Iran and Saudi Arabia, brokered not in Washington but in Beijing. The integration of Syria back into the Arab League despite American objections. The expansion of Iraqi-Iranian economic ties that bypass dollar-denominated trade. The Houthi control of strategic waterways that American naval power cannot challenge. These are not isolated incidents. They are the building blocks of a new regional architecture where American permission is no longer required, where American threats carry no weight, and where American presence is tolerated only as a diminishing legacy of a bygone era. If you value understanding how power actually shifts in the real world, if you refuse to accept the sanitized narratives that the establishment feeds you, then subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. The algorithm suppresses this analysis because it challenges the illusion of American omnipotence. Do not let them keep you in the dark about the most significant geopolitical transformation of our lifetime. The trigger event that crystallized this transformation was not a single dramatic moment, but a cascading series of strategic humiliations that exposed the hollowness of American power projection. Look at what happened in the Red Sea. The Houthis, a movement that the Western press dismissively labels as Iranian proxies, effectively closed one of the world's most critical shipping lanes to Israeli-bound vessels and challenged American naval supremacy in ways that would have been unthinkable just 5 years ago. The United States assembled what it grandly called Operation Prosperity Guardian, deploying billions of dollars worth of naval assets, Aegis destroyers equipped with the most advanced missile defense systems ever created, carrier strike groups that represent the pinnacle of American military technology. And yet, despite this overwhelming show of force, despite the presence of the most powerful navy ever assembled in human history, the Houthis continued their operations. They continued to strike vessels. They continued to demonstrate that American military might, when faced with asymmetric resistance rooted in political will rather than conventional force structures, is a paper tiger that roars loudly but cannot impose its will. This is not merely a tactical setback in a distant theater. This is a fundamental revelation about the nature of power in the 21st century. The Houthis are operating with modified anti-ship missiles, drones that cost a fraction of the weapons used to intercept them, and tactical intelligence that allows them to strike with precision despite facing the most sophisticated surveillance apparatus ever deployed. The cost exchange ratio is devastating for Washington. Every Houthi drone that costs perhaps $20,000 to produce requires an American interceptor missile that costs $3 million to destroy. Every engagement is a financial hemorrhage that the United States cannot sustain indefinitely. The mathematics of attrition warfare, the cold calculus that decides the outcome of prolonged conflicts, overwhelmingly favors the defenders operating on their own terrain with political legitimacy and popular support against an expeditionary force operating 7,000 miles from home with no coherent strategic objective beyond maintaining the illusion of dominance. But the Red Sea humiliation is merely the most visible symptom of a much deeper systemic failure. Consider what has transpired in Iraq over the past 18 months. The Iraqi parliament, the government that exists only because of the American invasion that destroyed the previous order, has repeatedly demanded the withdrawal of American forces. Not quietly, not through diplomatic back channels, but through formal legislative action and public statements that treat American military presence not as a partnership but as an occupation that has overstayed whatever limited welcome it once possessed. The United States has simply ignored these demands. Washington continues to maintain bases, continues to conduct operations, continues to pretend that Iraqi sovereignty is something that exists only when it aligns with American strategic interests. This is not the behavior of a confident superpower managing willing allies. This is the desperate flailing of an empire that knows it is losing control but cannot admit the reality without shattering the psychological foundation of its entire global posture. The establishment media will tell you that Iran is destabilizing the region, that Tehran is a source of chaos and conflict, that American presence is necessary to maintain order and protect freedom of navigation. But any student of realism, any observer who looks at the actual mechanics of power rather than the rhetoric of propaganda, knows that this narrative is precisely backwards. Iran has spent the past 5 years systematically building the architecture of American expulsion through diplomatic integration, economic connectivity, and the cultivation of allied movements that share a common interest in regional sovereignty free from external domination. The normalization agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, achieved through Chinese mediation in March 2023, was not merely a bilateral détente between historical rivals. It was the death knell of American divide and conquer strategies that have governed Middle Eastern politics since the Eisenhower administration. For 70 years, American influence in the region rested on a simple formula: keep the Sunni Arab states and Shia Iran at each other's throats, position Washington as the indispensable mediator and security guarantor, and ensure that regional powers never achieve sufficient unity to challenge American prerogatives. That formula is dead, killed not by American strategic vision evolving beyond it, but by the recognition among regional actors that American security guarantees are worthless and American mediation serves only American interests. To understand why we have arrived at this moment, why Iran has succeeded in this bloodless expulsion where conventional military resistance failed for decades, we must strip away the sanitized narratives of think tank publications and look at the raw machinery of imperial overextension. The United States has long operated under a doctrine that can be summarized simply: the Middle East is too important to be left to Middle Easterners. This belief is rooted in the post-World War II order, when American economic dominance was so absolute that it could dictate terms to devastated allies and defeated enemies alike. The establishment of the petrodollar system, the network of military bases that ringed the Soviet Union, the cultivation of client states from the Shah's Iran to the Gulf monarchies, all of this was sold as defensive containment of communism and the protection of the free world. But look beneath the rhetoric at the actual structure of power that was created. The United States positioned itself as the guarantor of energy flows that its own economy increasingly did not depend upon. American troops were not stationed in the Gulf to protect American oil supplies. They were there to ensure that European and Asian allies remained dependent on American military power for their energy security, creating a vassalage relationship disguised as partnership. This arrangement worked, after a fashion, as long as American economic and military dominance was so overwhelming that challenging it was unthinkable. But empires do not collapse when they are at their zenith. They collapse when the mechanisms of control that function during strength become anchors, dragging them down during decline. Consider the brutal mathematics of American military presence in the Middle East today. The United States maintains approximately 40,000 troops across the region, operates from dozens of bases and installations, deploys naval assets that represent tens of billions of dollars in hardware, and spends conservatively $200 billion annually on maintaining this military footprint when you account for the full life cycle costs of personnel, equipment, logistics, and operational tempo. And what does this staggering expenditure of blood and treasure accomplish? It does not secure American energy independence, which has been achieved through domestic production. It does not prevent regional conflicts, which have proliferated. It does not guarantee stability, which is more elusive than ever. It does not protect American allies, who are increasingly making independent arrangements that exclude Washington. What it does accomplish is the appearance of dominance, the illusion of control, the psychological comfort of believing that American power can still reshape a region according to its preferences. Iran has understood something that the architects of American strategy have been psychologically incapable of accepting. Military presence without political legitimacy, without economic integration, without alignment of interests, is not strength, it is vulnerability. Every American base in Iraq is not a projection of power. It is a hostage to political developments that Washington cannot control. Every ship in the Persian Gulf is not a symbol of dominance. It is a target in waters where the United States cannot achieve escalation dominance without triggering a regional conflagration that would shatter what remains of American global standing. The geographic reality of the Middle East, the simple fact that Iran sits astride the world's most critical energy choke point, while American power must be projected across oceans and maintained through logistics chains that stretch around the world, creates an asymmetry that no amount of technological superiority can overcome. The United States can strike Iran, it can inflict tremendous damage, but it cannot occupy Iran, cannot regime change Iran without a ground invasion that would make Iraq look like a minor skirmish, and most critically, cannot prevent Iran from closing the Strait of Hormuz and triggering an economic crisis that would dwarf anything witnessed in recent decades. This brings us to the systemic hypocrisy that has created the moral trap now closing around American Middle East policy. The central lie of American foreign policy in the region is the assertion that Washington seeks stability, democracy, and the rule of law. This mythology is so deeply embedded in the discourse of American exceptionalism that even sophisticated observers sometimes fail to recognize it as propaganda. Let us apply the cold logic of historical evidence to this claim. Look at Yemen. The United States has supported, armed, and provided intelligence for a Saudi-led bombing campaign that has created the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Hundreds of thousands dead, millions facing starvation, infrastructure systematically destroyed, and for what strategic objective? To prevent the Houthis, a movement with indigenous support and legitimate grievances, from controlling their own country. We were told this was necessary to counter Iranian influence, to prevent instability, to protect Saudi security. The reality was that the Saudis feared an independent Yemen on their border, and the United States was willing to facilitate mass starvation to maintain a client-state relationship. The result of this intervention was not the defeat of the Houthis, but their transformation into a hardened military force with capabilities that now threaten the entire regional order that the intervention was meant to preserve. Look at Syria. The United States intervened in a civil war under the banner of supporting moderate opposition to Assad's dictatorship. But look at the actual pattern of American action rather than the rhetoric. Washington armed groups that included jihadist elements, prolonged a conflict that might have ended years earlier with a fraction of the death toll, and currently occupies Syrian oil fields in direct violation of international law. Not to bring democracy to Syria, not to protect civilians, but to deny resources to a government that Washington has designated as an enemy and to maintain leverage in a conflict where American interests are served by continued chaos rather than resolution. The Syrian people, the actual human beings whose suffering is used to justify intervention, are props in a geopolitical game where their welfare is irrelevant except as a propaganda tool. When Assad uses chemical weapons, it is an atrocity that demands response. When American-backed forces level Raqqa, killing thousands of civilians, it is the unfortunate but necessary price of defeating ISIS, an organization that metastasized in the power vacuum created by the American destruction of Iraq. Look at Libya. The NATO intervention, led by the United States and enthusiastically supported by European allies, was sold as a humanitarian mission to prevent Gaddafi from committing genocide against his own people. The reality, revealed through leaked communications and subsequent investigation, was that Gaddafi had agreed to step down and was negotiating an exit that would have prevented the civil war. But the United States and its allies, seeing an opportunity to remove a leader who had challenged Western prerogatives and threatened to create an African currency that would compete with the dollar and euro, chose regime change over negotiated settlement. The result was not the flowering of democracy in Libya, but the complete collapse of the state, the emergence of competing militias and governments, the opening of migrant routes that have destabilized Europe, and the creation of slave markets, where human beings are bought and sold in the 21st century. Hillary Clinton, then Secretary of State, laughed about Gaddafi's brutal killing on camera, delivering the now infamous line that echoes as a perfect encapsulation of American policy. We came, we saw, he died. That laugh, that casual dismissal of a human being's murder and a nation's destruction, revealed more truth about American intentions than 1,000 position papers. This litany of intervention and destruction creates the moral trap that Iran has exploited with devastating effectiveness. When Tehran looks at Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Yemen, when Iranian strategists assess the pattern of American behavior rather than American rhetoric, they do not see a benevolent hegemon promoting democracy and stability. They see a declining empire that destroys what it cannot control, that values compliance over legitimacy, and that will sacrifice entire nations to maintain the illusion of dominance. The lesson that Iran has learned, the lesson that every nation watching American behavior has absorbed, is brutally simple. Disarmament leads to destruction. Gaddafi gave up his weapons programs and was murdered. Saddam Hussein had no weapons of mass destruction and was hanged. Assad kept his strategic capabilities and survived. North Korea developed nuclear weapons and is treated as a negotiating partner rather than a regime change target. The only guarantee of sovereignty in a world where the United States claims the right to determine which governments are legitimate is the capacity to make intervention so costly that Washington chooses to accept your existence rather than attempt your destruction. But the moral collapse is merely the visible symptom of a much deeper systemic rot that is hollowing out the foundations of American power across the entire region. While the world focuses on military posturing and diplomatic statements, a far more significant transformation is occurring in the economic architecture that determines actual influence rather than symbolic presence. When the United States withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018 and imposed what it termed maximum pressure sanctions, the policy was sold as a way to force Iran back to negotiations from a position of weakness. The theory, articulated by officials who had never studied the actual mechanics of sanctions effectiveness, was that economic pain would either trigger regime change or force Iranian capitulation. We were confidently told that Iran's economy would collapse within months. We were assured that the Iranian people would rise up against their government and demand alignment with American preferences. We were promised that maximum pressure would achieve what decades of previous sanctions had not. Look at the reality 5 years later. Iran's economy did not collapse. It adapted, restructured, and found ways to circumvent every mechanism of American financial control. The fundamental flaw in the sanctions strategy, the error that reveals how divorced American policy has become from economic reality, is the assumption that the United States still possesses the economic leverage it wielded in the unipolar moment of the 1,990 seconds. You cannot sanction a nation that produces essential commodities the world needs, that sits on massive hydrocarbon reserves, that has an educated population capable of sophisticated industrial production, and expect that nation to simply accept economic strangulation without finding alternatives. You can print dollars, you cannot print oil, natural gas, uranium, rare earth minerals, or the geopolitical position that allows control of maritime choke points. Iran did not collapse under maximum pressure. It accelerated the very processes that Washington most feared: de-dollarization, integration with China and Russia, development of alternative payment systems, expansion of domestic production capabilities, the creation of a network of relationships throughout the region that bypass American financial control entirely. The most devastating blow to American regional influence was the Iran-Saudi normalization agreement brokered by China in March 2023. For 70 years, the Iran-Saudi rivalry was the cornerstone of American divide and conquer strategy in the Middle East. Washington positioned itself as the essential mediator, the security guarantor that kept these regional powers from each other's throats. Billions of dollars in arms sales, strategic partnerships, military bases, all of this rested on the continuation of this rivalry. When China, not the United States, brought these historical enemies to an agreement, when Beijing demonstrated that it could achieve diplomatic outcomes that Washington claimed only American power could deliver, the entire architecture of American indispensability in the region collapsed. The message sent to every government from Cairo to Abu Dhabi was unmistakable. China can broker peace and facilitate trade. America brings military presence and demands compliance. Choose accordingly. The economic integration that is now accelerating across the Middle East, with Iran at the center of new trade routes and financial arrangements, represents a complete inversion of the order that American policy has spent decades trying to maintain. Iran is now Iraq's largest trading partner, conducting billions of dollars in cross-border commerce using local currencies that bypass dollar-denominated transactions. Iranian goods flow into Iraq despite American sanctions. Iraqi energy projects involve Iranian technical expertise and investment. The border between these nations, which the United States invaded Iraq partly to secure, is now an open economic corridor that Washington cannot monitor, cannot control, and cannot shut down without turning the Iraqi government, America's supposed ally, into an open enemy. Syria, devastated by civil war and facing reconstruction needs that dwarf available resources, is receiving Iranian credit lines, technical assistance, and political support that is far more valuable than anything the West offers, which is continued isolation and demands for regime change as the price of normalized relations, the Houthi control of maritime approaches to the Red Sea, the ability of a non-state actor to challenge freedom of navigation in one of the world's most critical waterways, demonstrates the complete failure of American military supremacy to impose order. The United States has the most powerful navy in human history. It maintains carrier strike groups that can project air power across thousands of miles. It possesses surveillance capabilities that can track individual vehicles from space, and yet it cannot prevent the Houthis from continuing operations that have forced shipping companies to reroute around Africa, adding weeks and massive costs to global supply chains. Why? Because sinking Houthi boats and destroying launch sites does not address the political reality that gives the Houthis legitimacy and support. You cannot bomb a population into accepting foreign domination of their coastline. You cannot missile strike your way to political legitimacy. The United States can destroy Houthi capabilities faster than they can be rebuilt. But it cannot do so without eventually striking targets inside Yemen that would cause civilian casualties significant enough to create exactly the kind of regional backlash that would unite the entire Middle East against American presence. This brings us to the fatal asymmetry that Iran has exploited with surgical precision. The United States has 800 military bases around the world. Massive investments in fixed infrastructure that represents projections of power, but also massive vulnerabilities. Iran does not need to match American military spending or capability. It needs only to make the cost of maintaining American presence higher than the benefits that presence delivers. Every attack on American forces in Iraq and Syria, conducted by groups that Iran supports but maintains deniability about, imposes costs that accumulate over time. Personnel must be rotated more frequently, reducing readiness. Force protection measures must be enhanced, diverting resources from other missions. The political pressure builds domestically as American families ask why their sons and daughters are being attacked in countries where their presence serves no clear national interest. Iran is not fighting a conventional war against the United States. It is conducting a campaign of managed attrition designed to make American presence so costly and so pointless that Washington eventually decides that the Middle East is no longer worth the expenditure of blood and treasure required to maintain even the illusion of control. The manufacturing of urgency around Iran's nuclear program, the constant warnings about breakout timelines and existential threats, serves to obscure the actual strategic picture. Iran does not need nuclear weapons to achieve its regional objectives. It has already achieved them through conventional means, through asymmetric capabilities, through political organization, and through the patient construction of networks that span from Lebanon to Yemen. The nuclear issue is a distraction that keeps Western analysts focused on a theoretical future threat while ignoring the concrete present reality of American expulsion. If Iran wanted nuclear weapons, it would have built them during the decades when it faced active threats of regime change and invasion. The fact that it has not, despite having the technical capability and the strategic justification, suggests that Iranian leadership has made a calculated decision that the costs of weaponization outweigh the benefits. Nuclear weapons would provide deterrence against existential threats. But Iran has already achieved effective deterrence through its conventional capabilities, its geographic position, its network of allied movements, and the recognition by American strategists that military action against Iran would trigger consequences that the United States cannot manage. This transformation has triggered a global reckoning that extends far beyond the Middle East itself. The world is witnessing the birth of a multipolar order where American permission is no longer required for nations to pursue their interests, where American threats carry diminishing weight, and where American presence is increasingly seen as a liability rather than an asset. The Abraham Accords, trumpeted by the Trump administration as a breakthrough that would isolate Iran and cement American influence through Israeli-Arab normalization, have been revealed as a hollow achievement that delivered neither isolation nor influence. The UAE and Bahrain normalized relations with Israel while simultaneously deepening economic ties with Iran and China. Saudi Arabia, the prize that Washington sought to bring into formal relations with Israel as the capstone of American regional strategy, has instead pursued independent diplomacy with Iran, invested billions in Chinese infrastructure projects, demanded respect for Palestinian rights as a condition for Israeli normalization, and signaled that its future lies in Eastern integration rather than Western dependence. The desperation in Washington is palpable even as the official statements maintain the fiction of control. The Biden administration has attempted to revive the nuclear agreement that Trump abandoned, recognizing belatedly that maximum pressure failed to achieve its objectives. But Iran, operating from a position of regional strength rather than the isolation that sanctions were supposed to create, has no incentive to accept the same terms that it might have agreed to when it was weaker. Why would Tehran surrender the leverage it has painstakingly built in exchange for sanctions relief that can be reimposed whenever American domestic politics shift? The administration has simultaneously tried to maintain military pressure through continued deployments and freedom of navigation operations while recognizing that actual military confrontation would be catastrophic. This policy paralysis, this inability to either credibly threaten force or genuinely pursue diplomacy, reveals an empire that has lost the initiative and is simply reacting to events it can no longer shape. The global South is watching this transformation with intense interest and drawing conclusions about the future of international order. When developing nations see the United States unable to impose its will in a region where it has been militarily present for decades, when they observe that China can broker diplomatic breakthroughs that American power cannot achieve, when they witness that resistance to American dictates is not only possible but can succeed without triggering regime change, they are making calculations about their own futures. The expansion of BRICS, the applications from nations across Asia, Africa, and Latin America to join an organization that explicitly positions itself as an alternative to Western-dominated institutions, represents a vote of no confidence in the American-led order. These nations are not necessarily anti-American in ideology or interest. They are simply recognizing the mathematical reality that aligning exclusively with Washington offers fewer benefits and more constraints than maintaining flexibility and balancing relationships across multiple power centers. Iran's success in removing American influence without triggering the military confrontation that would justify continued presence has created a template that other nations are studying carefully. You do not need to match American military capabilities to resist American hegemony. You need political legitimacy within your own region, economic relationships that provide alternatives to Western markets, asymmetric capabilities that make intervention too costly, and the patience to allow American overextension to create the conditions for its own withdrawal. This is the essence of the multipolar transition we are witnessing. Not a violent overthrow of American power, but a gradual erosion of the mechanisms through which that power was exercised. Iran did not invade American positions. It made those positions untenable through political organization, economic integration, and the cultivation of movements that share a common interest in regional sovereignty. The consequences of this transformation are already manifesting in ways that affect every person watching this analysis, regardless of where you live or what your political orientation might be. The inflation that is destroying the purchasing power of wages across the developed world is not primarily caused by domestic policy mistakes or pandemic disruptions. It is the direct result of a global system in transition where the mechanisms of dollar hegemony that allowed the United States to export its inflation for decades are breaking down, when nations trade in local currencies, when they build payment systems that bypass SWIFT, when they denominate energy contracts in yuan or rubles or gold-backed instruments instead of dollars, the demand for dollars decreases. That decreased demand, even at the margins, means that the dollars created through deficit spending and quantitative easing can no longer be absorbed by global markets as easily as before. Those dollars flow back to American shores in the form of higher prices for imported goods, reduced purchasing power, and a standard of living decline that no amount of statistical manipulation can hide from people experiencing it in their daily lives. The American working class is paying the price for imperial overreach through diminished economic security, while the benefits of empire flow to a narrower and narrower segment of the population. The military-industrial complex profits from endless deployments and arms sales. The financial sector benefits from dollar dominance even as it erodes. The foreign policy establishment maintains prestigious positions and lucrative consulting arrangements regardless of the catastrophic failures of the policies they advocate. But the ordinary citizen who cannot afford health care, who faces a housing market where prices have decoupled from wages, who sees infrastructure crumbling while billions flow to foreign bases, that citizen is beginning to ask the questions that the establishment desperately wants to suppress. Why are we spending blood and treasure to maintain influence in regions that provide no tangible benefit to American security or prosperity? Why are we making enemies of nations that could be trading partners? Why is the foreign policy consensus so disconnected from the interests of the people it purports to serve? Iran has succeeded in removing American influence from the Middle East not through military conquest, but through the patient construction of an alternative order that serves regional interests rather than external domination. The networks of political, economic, and military relationships that Tehran has built over decades have reached critical mass where they can sustain themselves without Iranian direction and resist American pressure without Iranian protection. The axis of resistance, derided by Western analysts as terrorist proxies, represents something far more significant. It is a constellation of movements with indigenous support and legitimate grievances that happen to share a common interest in ending American hegemony over their region. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the PMF in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, various Palestinian factions. These are not puppets controlled from Tehran. They are independent actors with their own objectives who have found in Iran a partner willing to provide support without demanding the kind of subordination that Western relationships require. We are standing at the absolute twilight of American dominance in the Middle East. The sun is setting on 8 decades of intervention, manipulation, and control. The shadows are lengthening across the region as nations reclaim sovereignty that was taken from them through coups, invasions, and the cultivation of client regimes. The choice facing the United States now is binary and unforgiving. There is no third option that preserves the illusion of dominance while acknowledging the reality of decline. The first path is the path of adaptation and strategic humility. It requires a painful but necessary admission that the unipolar moment is over, that the Middle East will be shaped by Middle Eastern powers rather than external intervention, and that American interests are better served through trade and diplomacy than through military presence and coercion. It would mean withdrawing from bases that serve no defensive purpose, ending support for interventions that create more enemies than they defeat, and accepting that oil will flow through markets regardless of who controls the wells. It would mean acknowledging that the trillions spent on Middle Eastern wars over the past 2 decades bought nothing of lasting value, and that the lives lost purchased no security that could not have been achieved through less destructive means. This path leads to resource redeployment toward domestic renewal, toward infrastructure and education and healthcare, toward rebuilding the social fabric that has been torn apart by decades of prioritizing empire over commonwealth. This path offers stability, sustainable foreign policy, and the possibility that America could become a normal nation among nations rather than a declining empire desperately clinging to faded glories. The second path is the path of denial and escalation. It is the refusal to accept that the world has changed, the insistence that one more intervention, one more sanctions package, one more show of force will restore the dominance that is slipping away. It involves doubling down on failed strategies because admitting failure would require confronting the lies that justified the original policies. It means risking direct military confrontation with Iran, a conflict that would make the Iraq invasion look like a minor border skirmish, that would close the Strait of Hormuz and trigger global economic crisis, that would unite the entire region against American presence, and that could escalate to involvement by Russia and China in ways that risk great power confrontation. This path leads inevitably to catastrophic outcomes, to the final destruction of American credibility, to economic collapse that would dwarf the 2008 financial crisis, and potentially to conflicts that could spiral beyond anyone's control. Tragically, every signal from Washington suggests that the establishment has chosen the second path. They are psychologically incapable of accepting multipolarity, constitutionally unable to admit that their theories about American indispensability were self-serving mythology rather than geopolitical reality. The neoconservative intellectuals who sold the Iraq War are still publishing in prestigious journals and appearing on television panels. The officials who implemented maximum pressure on Iran have moved seamlessly to new positions where they advocate for pressure on China. The think tanks, funded by defense contractors, continue to produce papers arguing for increased military spending to counter threats that their own policies created. They would rather see the global system collapse than admit they were wrong about the fundamental nature of power in the 21st century. Iran's bloodless expulsion of American influence from the Middle East is a warning shot across the bow of the entire Western-led international order. It demonstrates that resistance to American hegemony is not only possible but can succeed without triggering the overwhelming military response that was supposed to make such resistance unthinkable. It proves that economic sanctions, the weapon that Washington has wielded with increasing promiscuity, can be circumvented by nations willing to bear short-term pain for long-term sovereignty. It reveals that American military supremacy, real enough in terms of raw capability, cannot translate into political outcomes when the populations being threatened have more to fear from capitulation than from resistance. This channel exists to tell you the truths that the establishment wants to bury beneath propaganda and distraction. We analyze the world as it actually operates rather than how the foreign policy elite wish it operated. The algorithm suppresses this content because it challenges the comfortable myths that allow failed policies to continue. If you want to understand the forces reshaping global order, if you refuse to accept sanitized narratives that ignore inconvenient realities, then subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Do not let them keep you ignorant about the transformation that will define the rest of your lives. I want to hear your analysis in the comments below. First, do you believe that American withdrawal from the Middle East is now inevitable, or can Washington find a way to restore its influence through some strategy that has not yet been attempted? Second, as Iran consolidates regional influence without American interference, does this represent a more stable order for the Middle East, or simply the replacement of one hegemon with another? Write your answers below. I will be reading them. Stay vigilant.